4 men from a recon team were deep behind enemy lines in Vietnam, isolated, surrounded, and running out of time. In the dead of night, the jungle was silent except for their pounding hearts. Then came the flickers of movement in the shadows, an enemy force closing in from every direction. Their worst nightmare had come true. They'd been spotted. Whispering urgently over their radio, they called for backup, planted claymore mines all around, and braced themselves for the unthinkable. Command soon came back with the coldest words a soldier could hear. Rescue canceled, too dangerous. But 2 fearless pilots flying Cobra helicopters refused to accept that. Against orders, they decided to take matters into their own hands. What they pulled off next would test every ounce of their skill, courage, and luck. This wasn't going to be just another mission, it was going to be survival against impossible odds. Before we get to that wild rescue, we need to talk about why the Cobra even existed, because its origin story is just as intense. When the Vietnam War kicked off, the U.S., the military thought helicopter speed alone would keep crews safe from enemy fire. Big mistake. Out of roughly 12,000 helicopters sent into Vietnam, around half ended up destroyed, and a massive chunk of those were shot down in combat. The legendary Bell UA-1 Huey, the workhorse of the war, was an icon but not exactly built for survival. It was made of lightweight aluminum and plexiglass to boost speed and lift, but it couldn't stop bullets, not even from small arms. The only real protection was a few slabs of steel under the pilot seats, and around key components barely enough to deflect a single hit. As the war dragged on and North Vietnamese troops got smarter, they began reading American patterns like a book. The once brilliant air-mobile tactic dropping soldiers right into or near the fight became predictable. Soon enemy forces were waiting in ambush, ready to tear helicopters out of the sky. For those pilots and crews, every mission turned into a gamble with death. Things got even deadlier for helicopter crews once they had to hover low over the battlefield. That's the moment every pilot dreaded, stuck in the open sky, motionless targets surrounded by enemies itching to take them down. Whether dropping off troops or pulling them out, those few seconds of hovering turned the helicopter into a sitting duck in hostile territory, catching fire from every direction imaginable. Snipers, machine guns, mortars, and RPGs blazing from the jungle. It wasn't just random gunfire either. The North Vietnamese were stacked with Soviet-supplied anti-aircraft weapons. We're talking heavy, 51 caliber machine guns and autocannons that could shred a chopper like paper. Even a single short burst from an AK-47, if it hit the right spot, oil lines, coolant, or fuel tanks, meant the end. Once that happened, the bird was going down fast, usually in flames. Some crews didn't just get shot down once, they got hit twice. There were cases where the rescue helicopter sent to save a downed crew got blown out of the sky right after picking them up. Early in the war, the U.S. command was stunned. Helicopters were being torn apart everywhere, left, right, and center, and no one seemed to have a real fix. While generals debated solutions from the comfort of their air-conditioned offices, the soldiers out in the mud decided they couldn't wait around. They started improvising their own armor and firepower. Unlike the transport truck drivers who could load up sandbags and steel plates for protection, helicopter crews had no such luxury. The extra weight would ground them. So, they got creative with what they had. The first big step came when the Hueys started flying armed. At the start, they only had the crew's sidearms and rifles, basically nothing against heavy fire. But then came the crew chiefs, the third member aboard, alongside the pilot and co-pilot, who decided to change the game. They grabbed M60 machine guns, rigged them to the sides of the helicopter using bungee cords or homemade mounts, and turned the Huey into a makeshift gunship. Suddenly, those birds could bite back. The crew chief's M60 wasn't just for show. He'd light up one whole side of the helicopter during takeoffs and landings, blasting at anything that looked even remotely suspicious. Every time they came under fire, he'd return it with everything he had. It wasn't perfect, but it was a serious upgrade from being completely defenseless. Soon, someone realized there was a blind spot the other side, so they added a fourth crew member to handle that. That's how the door gunner, also known as the shotgun rider, was born. This guy wasn't just extra muscle, he became the heart of the crew. He handled maintenance, helped load gear, and when the chopper dropped into a hot landing zone, He unleashed hell on the enemy below. With two gunners blazing on both sides, the Huey finally had teeth and people noticed. That's when someone asked the question that changed everything. What if we added even more firepower? That idea sparked a revolution. They started testing heavier setups, twin M60s, grenade launchers, even miniguns that could spit thousands of rounds a minute. Soon they were adding forward-firing machine guns and rocket pods, turning those birds into flying beasts. Eventually, some Hueys were modified to carry nothing but weapons, built purely for attack runs. That's how the Huey gunships were born, the first of their kind. These gunships could swoop in low, hammer enemy positions, and give troops on the ground the kind of close air support they'd never had before. They also flew escort missions for the transport Hueys nicknamed Slicks, guarding them as they flew into chaotic hot zones under fire. The transformation was incredible, but one major problem still lingered. All those extra guns, rockets, and ammo made the Huey gunships heavy, too heavy. They guzzled fuel fast and couldn't fly long enough to clear landing zones ahead of the Slicks, stay to cover troop insertions, and then hang around to support soldiers on the ground afterward. What they really needed was a helicopter built for battle from the ground up, fast, maneuverable, and deadly. And let's be real, the Huey was never meant to trade blows in direct combat. It was a transport bird, not a brawler. Turning it into a gunship was like trying to armor up a delivery truck and call it a tank. And yes, believe it or not, the military was actually doing that too. But that's another story. Still, the experiment worked well enough to prove a game-changing point: helicopters could absolutely dominate in an attack role if they were built on the right platform. The stage was set for a whole new kind of war machine to take the skies. And this is where the Cobra storms into the story. Before it came along, a few prototypes for attack helicopters had been built, but none ever got off the ground in a serious way. Then Bell Helicopter had a genius idea. Why start from scratch when they already had something that worked? They took the Huey's trusted engine, transmission, and rotor system, the backbone of America's helicopter fleet, and squeezed it all into a brand new body that was only 36 inches wide, with tandem cockpits stacked one behind the other. The result was the Model 209, a sleek, razor-thin flying machine that looked like something out of the future. It kept about 80% of the Huey's parts, but that new, narrow frame made it faster, deadlier, and harder to hit. Small stub wings were added to carry rockets and gun pods, giving it some serious bite. When the U.S. military saw it in action during testing, they were blown away. The thing was agile, quick, and could deliver massive firepower with precision. Now, at the time, the Army was waiting for another fancy project, the AH-56 Cheyenne, to become their next-generation attack helicopter. But that bird was years away from being ready, and the Vietnam War wasn't waiting for anyone. The military needed something fast right now. So they told Bell to crank production into overdrive and get the new gunship combat-ready as soon as humanly possible. After a few tweaks and some added protection, the AH-1G Cobra was born, the world's first dedicated attack helicopter. It officially took flight in 1967 and was immediately shipped off to Vietnam for its combat debut. Soldiers on the ground had never seen anything like it. The Cobra's narrow fuselage didn't just make it look mean, it made it fast and tough to hit head-on. The pilot sat in the rear seat, in control of the forward-firing weapons, while the co-pilot, gunner, sat up front, commanding the chin-mounted turret and rocket pods. The two had to work like a synchronized team to survive. They communicated constantly, reacting to enemy fire and coordinating attacks on the fly. To keep them alive, the Cobra came with armored seats, self-sealing fuel tanks, and a design that could take more punishment than any helicopter before it. Sure, it still relied on speed as its best defense, and those thin plexiglass windshields wouldn't stop much, but the crews adapted. They wore flak jackets and strapped on chicken plates, slabs of ceramic armor across their chests to stop incoming bullets that might punch through the glass. The Cobra wasn't just a weapon, it was a statement. A symbol that helicopters could now go on the offensive, not just ferry troops. It was fast, fierce, and built for war. Each Cobra came strapped with stub wings on either side of its slender body. And these weren't for show. They carried rocket pods, loaded with Hydra 70, 2.75-inch unguided rockets that could rain down destruction in all sorts of ways. Depending on the mission, those rockets could pack high explosive, smoke, or illumination warheads, and each pod could hold anywhere from 7 to 19 rockets. That's a serious amount of firepower for one bird. But the real magic, the thing that made soldiers stare in awe, was the Cobra's nose turret. Mounted right up front was a 7.62mm M134 minigun alongside a 40mm automatic grenade launcher, turning the helicopter's face into a high-tech fanged weapon. The gunner could swivel and blast across a wide arc, or the pilot could lock the turret forward and aim by literally pointing the entire helicopter. It was precise, brutal, and lightning-fast all in one. That setup was just the starting point. As combat raged on, the Cobra's weapon systems evolved rapidly. Engineers began strapping on extra forward-firing miniguns, 20mm rotary cannons, and later, TOW anti-tank missiles that could take out armored vehicles from a distance. The Cobra wasn't just another support chopper anymore, it was transforming into a full-blown battle predator. But unlike the Huey, the Cobra wasn't built to carry passengers besides the pilot and co-pilot, gunner. There was no room for anyone else. That detail would prove very important later on, especially in the daring rescue mission of a pilot whose story became legendary. Now, let's talk about speed and handling, because the Cobra was a thrill ride in the sky. It could hit top speeds of around 219 kilometers per hour and cover 300 kilometers on a single run. Pilots loved flying it. This thing could skim just a few feet above treetops, rivers, or open fields in a maneuver known as nap of the earth flight. That technique kept the rotor noise hidden under the terrain line, letting Cobras sneak right up on the enemy before suddenly popping up and striking hard. Of course, flying like that was dangerous as hell. It took nerves of steel and top-tier skill to control a Cobra at low altitude. It wasn't a forgiving machine, and one wrong move could end everything in seconds. But for those who mastered it, the Cobra felt alive, fast, fierce, and responsive, like a wild animal that just needed to be steered toward the fight. By the late stages of the Vietnam War, around 300 Cobras were tearing through the skies, replacing the slower and heavier Huey gunships. Their speed, agility, and sheer firepower completely changed the battlefield. The enemy quickly learned what the troops on the ground already knew when the snakes came hissing in low over the trees. You didn't stick around to find out what happened next. With Cobras on call, ground troops could summon deadly accurate air support at a moment's notice, raining precise, controlled chaos exactly where it was needed most. Unlike the fast fighter jets screaming overhead, the Cobra could fly low and close enough to actually see what was happening on the ground. Fighter pilots often moved too fast to tell friend from foe, and tragic mistakes happened. Friendly units sometimes got hit with bombs or napalm, and it wasn't rare. It was the dark side of high-speed warfare. The North Vietnamese, knowing this weakness, came up with a brutal but clever move called hugging the belt. They'd stay as close as possible to American troops, sometimes just meters apart, so that calling in air or artillery strikes became dangerously risky. Every time ground forces tried to get help, they ran the risk of being hit themselves. That's where the Cobra changed the game. Its pilots could literally see the battlefield below, identify where the enemy was hiding, and unleash precise fire right where it was needed, without putting friendly soldiers in danger. Ground troops loved seeing those sleek shapes appear overhead. It meant help was close, accurate, and deadly to the enemy. Soon, Cobras started escorting Hueys, both the slicks that carried troops into battle, and the dust-offs flying medevac missions to rescue the wounded. But then, someone came up with a bold idea, some would say crazy. It was called the Hunter-Killer mission. In these daring operations, Cobras teamed up with smaller OH-6 Loach scout helicopters in a tag team of death and nerves. The men flying those Loaches weren't just pilots, they were fearless. Their job? To draw enemy fire on purpose. The Loach would fly low and slow, skimming treetops or open fields, poking around suspected enemy zones, while the Cobra stayed high and hidden, waiting like a hawk. If the Loach spotted anything, or worse, started taking fire, the two-man crew would toss out a smoke grenade to mark the enemy's position, then yank the chopper away in a desperate escape. That was the Cobra's cue to dive straight in, unleashing rockets and gunfire with surgical precision. It was an insane system, but it worked. These hunter-killer teams became one of the most effective tactics in the war. The Seamsint arrived at just a vile 40. The enemy quickly learned that shooting at a harmless-looking little helicopter might mean a Cobra strike seconds later. Still, it came at a cost. Many Loaches were hit and brought down during these missions. Those crews knew the risk every time they lifted off, but they did it anyway. That's how gutsy these pilots were. With Cobras and Loaches working together, the battlefield changed forever. Precision, teamwork, and raw courage turned chaos into control. Even for the Cobras, life in the sky was no walk in the park. At the height of the Vietnam War, nearly 1,100 Cobras of all variants were flying across the country, logging over 1 million combat hours in some of the harshest conditions imaginable. So it's no shock that about 300 of them never made it back, a massive loss when you think about it. That's roughly 1 Cobra gone for every 3 or 4 that flew into battle. Take Operation Lamson, for example. In just 6 brutal weeks, 26 Cobras were shot down. The sky was filled with tracers, smoke, and chaos. But even then, those pilots kept flying. Because when it came down to it, no other machine in the world could do what the Cobra could. Flying low, fast, and deadly precise, protecting troops when nobody else could reach them. And now it's time for the story you've been waiting for. The one that shows what happens when a Cobra is flown by men who refuse to quit, even when death is staring them in the face. It was the 18th of June 1968, and deep behind enemy lines in South Vietnam, a 4-man long-range reconnaissance patrol was on a secret mission. Their call sign? Wildcat Team. Their job? Slip through enemy territory undetected and gather intel on troop movements. It was dangerous beyond belief, no backup, no easy escape, and if they got caught, nobody was coming fast enough to save them. That night, around 9 p.m., the jungle was soaked in darkness. The only light came from the stars and the faint glow of a starlight scope in the hands of Sergeant David Hill, the team leader. When he peered through it, his blood ran cold. Enemy soldiers were closing in, surrounding them on 3 sides. Seconds later, the 4th side, their only escape route, was cut off too. They were trapped in the middle of an open rice paddy, exposed, with around 80 enemy fighters moving in fast. There was no way out. The men pressed themselves into a narrow water buffalo trail, silent and tense. They set claymore mines around their position, checked their ammo, and positioned themselves back to back, each one watching a different direction. There was no room for panic now, just grim focus. They all knew exactly what was coming next. Sergeant Hill and his men whispered prayers, knowing they likely wouldn't see the morning. Private First Class Robert Elsner grabbed the radio, his voice low but urgent, sending out a desperate plea. They needed artillery, air support, anything that could reach them before the enemy did. The response that came back was brief, and it would change everything that happened next. There wasn't much command could do that night, and truth be told, they didn't want to. Reports say higher-ups hesitated to launch a rescue, believing it would cost more lives to save those 4 men than to leave them to their fate. But not everyone was willing to sit back and do nothing. When that desperate call came over the radio, First Lieutenant Larry Taylor, stationed near Saigon, heard it loud and clear. Without wasting a second, he and his co-pilot Joe Ratliff sprinted to their AH-1G Cobra, call sign Dark Horse 32. Alongside them, another Cobra crew. Captain Roger Tricar and Captain Richard Driggs joined in as their wingmen. They knew the odds, but they didn't care. They strapped in, fired up their engines, and launched into the black void of night. The sky was pitch dark, no moon, no lights on the ground, just endless shadows. They had to rely solely on radio direction to find a small recon team surrounded by dozens of enemy soldiers in the middle of nowhere. No GPS, no thermal imaging, no modern night vision, just skill, instinct, and guts. After roughly 20 tense minutes, the 2 Cobras reached the area and tried to make contact. The recon team whispered through the static, terrified that even the sound of their voices could give them away. Taylor listened carefully, trying to get an exact fix on their position. He refused to fire a single rocket until he was absolutely certain where those 4 men were. One wrong move, and his own weapons could wipe them out. They came up with a risky plan. The team on the ground would confirm once the Cobra was directly overhead, and that's when Taylor would know where to start his run. When the Cobra swooped above them, the soldiers confirmed, but in the darkness, the pilots still couldn't see them. Taylor then gave one of the most dangerous orders of the night. "Pop a flare!" It was a last resort. The recon team fired one up, and instantly the jungle lit up like daylight. Their position was revealed not just to the Cobras, but to every enemy gun within range. Within seconds, chaos erupted. The North Vietnamese opened fire from all sides, bullets cutting through the air like lightning. The Cobras dove straight into the fight, unleashing minigun bursts and rockets at muzzle flashes below. The air filled with tracers, explosions, and smoke, and the recon team fired back with whatever small arms they had, fighting for every second of survival. For 45 relentless minutes, both Cobras hammered enemy positions, swooping in, firing, pulling up, and diving again. They were taking hits too. Multiple rounds slammed into their hulls, rattling the cockpits, but Taylor and his crew didn't back off for a moment. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and flying blind in the dark, but there was no way they were leaving those 4 men behind. With enemy fire lighting up the night sky, Taylor called in a rescue Huey to extract the trapped recon team while the Cobras tried desperately to hold off the attackers. The plan was simple: buy just enough time for the Huey to land, grab the 4 men, and get out alive. But as Taylor circled over the chaos, his radio crackled with bad news: the Huey wasn't coming. Headquarters had canceled the rescue. The ground fire was too intense, and command decided it was too risky. Taylor couldn't believe it. He kept calling back, begging for confirmation, hoping someone would change their mind. But the answer stayed the same: rescue aborted. In other words, those 4 men were on their own. By now, both Cobras were running low on fuel and ammunition. Command ordered them to return to base, leave the recon team behind, and cut their losses. For most pilots, that would have been the end of the line. But Taylor wasn't built like most. Even as he checked his gauges and saw the fuel running dangerously low, his mind was spinning, calculating, plotting, refusing to give up. Down below, the recon team radioed in again. Their voices were breaking with exhaustion and fear. They were out of ammo, with nothing left but a few hand grenades, and everyone knew what that meant. They were saving those grenades for themselves rather than be captured alive. Taylor's response came sharp and commanding. "Set your claymores on one side of the rice paddy. When I give the signal, blow them and run like hell in the opposite direction toward the clearing." It was insane, but it was their only shot. Then Taylor turned to his wingman. His partner was nearly out of fuel too, so Taylor ordered him to fire off every last rocket and round they had left, empty the guns. Then head back to base. Once the wingman pulled out, Taylor stayed behind alone. He still had a few bursts left in his minigun, a couple of rockets, and a heart full of defiance. Both Cobras unleashed everything they had left, ripping the jungle apart one last time. The explosions faded, the guns went silent, and that was it. They were completely out of ammo. But Taylor wasn't done. He keyed the radio again. Now, the team detonated their claymores, the ground erupting in a blinding flash that tore through the enemy's front line. In that split second of chaos, Taylor flicked on his landing lights, dove low, and made a mock strafing run, even without ammo, to draw enemy fire toward himself. Tracers streaked past his cockpit as he buzzed the treetops, but he didn't flinch. He was giving those men the distraction they needed to sprint for the clearing. Then came the impossible part. Taylor banked hard, looped around, and dropped down through the gunfire to land. The Cobra's cockpit was built for 2 people, total, and he was about to try something no one had ever done before. When the recon team spotted Taylor's Cobra touching down under enemy fire, they didn't hesitate for a second. They ran for their lives. With bullets cracking past them and explosions lighting up the rice paddy, the 4 men sprinted toward the chopper, tossing their last hand grenades behind them to keep the enemy's heads down. Taylor later said he didn't need to say a word. Those men knew exactly what to do. They jumped onto the Cobra's skids and rocket pods, clinging to whatever they could grab. The whole pickup lasted barely 10 seconds, but it felt like forever. Then came 2 hard taps on Taylor's canopy, the signal from his co-pilot. Go. Now came the impossible part: getting out alive. Taylor couldn't just yank the Cobra up like normal. The rotor wash would have blown the men right off. So he carefully balanced the controls, flying just steady enough to keep them hanging on, while still swerving and weaving to dodge the deadly tracer rounds slicing through the air. Every second was a gamble. By his calculations, they had a 25-minute flight back to base, but only 20 minutes of fuel left. It was a race against time, gravity, and the limits of the machine itself. Once they were finally clear of enemy range, Taylor found a safe clearing and gently touched down so the 4 survivors could jump off and connect with nearby friendly troops. Only after confirming they were safe did he push the Cobra back into the air, racing home on fumes. When the team hit the ground, they immediately turned back to salute the man who just saved their lives. "What's your name, sir?" they shouted as he lifted off. That name, Larry Taylor, would become legend. His Cobra barely limped back to base, fuel needles scraping empty. Between both helicopters that night, they'd unleashed 32,000 rounds from their miniguns and fired over 150 rockets, defying orders and putting their own lives on the line for 4 soldiers they'd never even met. For that courage, the pilots received silver and bronze stars. But Taylor's story didn't end there. Decades later, his Silver Star was upgraded to the Medal of Honor in 2023, a long overdue recognition for a man who refused to abandon his brothers in arms. But the legend of the Cobra didn't end with Vietnam either. While the iconic Huey was mostly retired after the war, the Cobra kept evolving, upgraded, armored, and rebuilt for new generations of combat. It gained night vision systems, laser rangefinders, and a deadlier 20mm cannon, along with stronger armor to protect its pilots. These improvements turned the Cobra into one of the most dependable attack platforms in military aviation. The helicopter saw heavy action again during the 1992 Gulf War, Operation Desert Storm, proving it could still dominate decades after its birth. Even today, modernized Cobras are in service across multiple countries, packing Hellfire missiles and high-tech targeting systems. Its direct descendant, the AH-1Z Viper, remains one of the most feared and capable attack helicopters in the world. However, the U.S. Army eventually shifted its focus to an even more advanced successor, the AH-64 Apache. That machine took everything the Cobra had pioneered and pushed it further: better armor, advanced sensors, and all-weather precision strike power. Still, the Cobra's legacy is untouchable. Born in the chaos of Vietnam, it changed the way wars were fought from the sky, and thanks to brave pilots like Larry Taylor, it became more than just a weapon. It became a symbol of courage, loyalty, and pure defiance against the impossible.